In the hustle and bustle of the world, have we ever yearned for a simpler, purer life? Laozi, in Chapter 19 of the Tao Te Ching, sketches out a blueprint for an ideal society. In this episode, we will delve into how reducing desires can guide people towards a more harmonious existence. Are you ready to follow the wisdom of Laozi to uncover the secrets of bringing the greatest welfare to the people? This is more than just a philosophical discussion. It is a spiritual awakening. Let's read the original text of Laozi. Abandon sageliness and discard wisdom, and the people will benefit 100-fold. Abandon benevolence and discard righteousness, and the people will return to filial piety and kindness. Abandon cunning and discard profit, and there will be no thieves. These three, as insufficient for governing, thus there are further instructions. Be plain in your appearance, embrace simplicity, have few thoughts and few desires, abandon learning, and be without worries. Though brief, these ancient words contain profound wisdom. They tell us that when we let go of excessive cleverness and wisdom, the people will reap greater benefits. When we cease the pursuit of external benevolence and righteousness, people will revert to their innate filial and kind nature. When we discard skill and profit, society will be free of thieves. Laozi reminds us here that true governance is not reliant on red tape, but on returning the people to a simple, unadorned life, reducing selfish desires, lowering wants, discarding useless knowledge, and thus achieving a state of carefreeness. Now, let us step into the world of Laozi and explore how reducing desires can lead to harmony for both the individual and society. This is not just a journey of knowledge, but a cleansing of the soul. Let us learn how to find inner peace and contentment in this troubled world. Laozi uses the term abandon 3 times in a row, signaling the need to eliminate these aspects. Let's start with the first sentence. He says that by discarding sageliness and wisdom, the common folk will reap 100-fold benefit. The sage in Laozi's writing, with whom we are familiar, refers to the ruler who has comprehended the Tao, an ideal archetype. However, focusing solely on the character for sage, it originally meant a person of utmost intelligence. In traditional Chinese script, the character for sage consists of the radical for ear on the left and present on the right. Thus, in etymology, it is said to be formed from the ear, hence pronounced sage. Since it is associated with the ear, it signifies someone who understands instantly. One's intelligence can be judged by their ability to easily comprehend others' words. As for wisdom, it refers to cunning, a person who can read between the lines and come up with many schemes. So, the entire sentence implies that by discarding cleverness and wisdom, the people will gain 100-fold benefit. What is he saying? He's saying that the people will not need to compete with others, will not need to intrigue. Let's consider, once everyone starts competing with their intelligence, that's truly troublesome. No matter how capable you are, you cannot defeat many with just your 2 hands. Even if you are as wise as Zhuge Liang, there is a saying, 3 cobblers with their wits combined equal Zhuge Liang the mastermind. If everyone competes and compares, it never ends, just like warfare, employing various risky moves to outsmart the enemy. Thus, by eliminating sageliness and wisdom, the people will live more simply, happily, and even more relaxed. The abandon sageliness and discard wisdom mentioned here is to set aside the worldly perceived intelligence, making life much simpler, known as fame and profit 100-fold. Looking at the second point, discarding benevolence and righteousness allows the people to restore their innate filial piety and kindness. Benevolence and righteousness represent noble moral standards. If we no longer concern ourselves with issues of benevolence and righteousness, we can return to a natural state. It is particularly mentioned here that the common people restore their innate filial piety and kindness. What does innate mean? It means it is a natural situation. You don't need to specifically tell them this is filial piety or that is kindness. No need for such value judgments. People get along naturally. However, benevolence and righteousness are deliberately demanded Balshanchulaida. This creates various distinctions, and it is evident that filial piety and love are innate to humans. Looking at the third point, he says, abandon cunning and discard profit, and there will be no thieves. If you remove skill and profit, thieves will disappear. Thieves flaunt their skills to gain profit. We often say, desperate thieves take risks, referring to thieves. If a society does not overly emphasize intelligence and righteousness, nor pursue skill and profit, it will return to a more normal state, allowing people to live simply and according to their nature. Next, the original text emphasizes that these three aspects, no matter how regulated, are merely superficial changes. To truly govern the world, it is not enough to just remove these 3 points. You must also be able to actively guide. When talking about education, there are always 2 aspects to consider. First, remove the bad parts. Second, guide towards the good parts. There must be both destruction and establishment. So here, it is emphasized that the first 3 can only be used to deal with affairs, removing some bad situations, which is not enough to govern the world. What then? Next, it is necessary to let the people have a place to rely on. He also mentions 3 aspects. The first is appear plain and embrace simplicity. Be simple and stay unadorned. The words plain and simplicity are very special. Plain refers to white silk that has not yet been dyed. Simplicity refers to simple, original wood that has not been carved. So what is said here is to let you be simple and stay unadorned. The 4 characters, appear plain and embrace simplicity, are in response to the previous benevolence and righteousness. Benevolence and righteousness are meant to dye you with various beautiful colors, carve you into something beautiful, and deliberately do good deeds, exceeding others in doing good. In this way, the state of plain and simplicity is lost. So if you deliberately act to become the so-called good person, you are no longer in your original state. Therefore, you must use appear plain and embrace simplicity to counter the previous abandon benevolence and discard righteousness. Then, looking at fewer selfishness and less desire. Reduce selfishness and lower desires. Fewer selfishness and less desire are aimed at the thieves that appeared before with skill and profit. What things show cunning, and what situations are profitable? If everyone can have fewer selfishness and less desire, then everyone will reduce their selfishness and lower their desires. Naturally, there will be no problems in this regard. How can thieves appear? It is worth comparing with the words fewer desires, which Mencius of Confucianism also said, there is no better way to cultivate the mind than to have fewer desires. The best way to cultivate your mind is to reduce desires. The word cultivate the mind we often see in many dramas. When he goes to the palace, there is a hall of cultivating the mind. This shows that even emperors need to cultivate their minds. But who among them can achieve the state of fewer desires? In Laozi's words, he also emphasizes fewer desires. This means that any school of thought will advise to reduce desires. Desires can roll like a snowball, and if allowed to develop freely, the consequences are unimaginable. It is most likely to drive a person crazy. Therefore, it is necessary to emphasize fewer selfishness and less desire to deal with the so-called thieves before. The last point is called abandon learning and be without worries. These 4 characters must be explained first. If you see the Wangbai version or other versions, they will put the 4 characters abandon learning and be without worries at the beginning of the next chapter, which is the beginning of chapter 20. Because ancient books do not have standard punctuation and the division of chapters is not very clear. But if you refer to the Silk manuscript, the A and B versions, they all follow, appear plain and embrace simplicity, fewer thoughts and fewer desires, with the 4 characters, abandon learning and be without worries. The writing of the Silk manuscript is more reasonable. Why? Because you mention 3 aspects at the beginning, what you want to abandon and what you want to discard. Then you say at the end that 3 aspects are not enough. What should you do? Of course, there must be 3 more targeted suggestions, so that the common people know what specific actions you have against the previous 3 points. Instead of just saying abandon and discard, and then I only talk about 2 points later, what should I do? Appear plain and embrace simplicity is aimed at the previous benevolence and righteousness, and fewer selfishness and less desire is aimed at the previous skill and profit. What about the first point of sageliness and wisdom? How could this be ignored? Finally, it is said that abandoning knowledge without worries is called abandon learning and be without worries. It is aimed at the first sentence of this chapter, abandon sageliness and discard wisdom. If you don't pursue too much knowledge, you will reduce worries. This is more reasonable. People have a lot of worries, or the troubles of life, starting from the beginning of literacy. As soon as you start to recognize characters, you have to make distinctions. After the distinction, various deviant desires emerge, followed by various troubles and sorrows. So it is said that abandon learning and be without worries, not knowing anything clearly, not delving into the investigation, but living more relaxed and at ease. But you still have to ask, abandon learning and be without worries. What is the so-called learning? Generally speaking, learning has 2 aspects. One is to learn various kinds of knowledge. The other is to learn the way of life. If learning the way of life makes you understand how to deal with things and how to handle affairs, there is no problem. But usually what we learn, starting from school education, most of it is knowledge. I have studied at Yale University for 4 years in my life. Every time I go to the library, I think of Laozi's words, which makes sense. Because the Yale University Library has a collection of more than 7 million books, and there are several bookshelves related to my research. Every time I pass by, I feel that abandon learning and be without worries still makes sense. Therefore, we have moved the first sentence of chapter 20, abandon learning and be without worries, to the end of chapter 19 in many versions, which has its rationality. We will see later that chapter 20 introduces the differences between sages or enlightened people and ordinary people in their performance. Of course, we cannot really get rid of the previous sageliness and wisdom, or not practice benevolence and righteousness, or give up all skill and profit today when we learn from Laozi. But if you want to take control of your life and reduce external interference, you can still grasp, appear plain and embrace simplicity, fewer selfishness and less desire, while reducing unnecessary knowledge. Because the problem is not that you don't have knowledge, but that you are worried about too much knowledge, which is unanchored. In the end, you absorb a lot of information, but you can't judge the value, which instead causes a lot of troubles in life. So the British poet T.S. Eliot has a poem called The Rock. There is a sentence in it that is very precise. He said, "Where has the wisdom lost and our knowledge gone? Where has the knowledge lost and our information gone?" These 2 sentences use the words information, knowledge, and wisdom. So here, we need to know how to grasp the key points in learning. In addition, in terms of values, many concepts are relative. At a certain time and in a certain society, there are such values, but for every individual, they may not be appropriate. So in Laozi's thinking, in chapter 19, he holds a reserved attitude and criticizes all kinds of things in the world that are thought to be beneficial. If you can really abandon and discard, like Laozi, it may be easier to enter a state of freedom. So what have we learned from this episode? We have a reverse thinking about all kinds of things in the world that everyone thinks are worth pursuing. In fact, when we learn from Laozi, we should often have a dialectical viewpoint. The so-called dialectic is that any statement has a positive and a negative side, allowing us to understand and abandon some unreasonable parts to promote. Integrate the positive and negative sides to a harmonious state. When it reaches a harmonious state, we can make some choices from the advantages of both sides. Of course, Laozi's dialectical method of unity of opposites is judged from a longer-term and long-term perspective. Some seemingly beneficial things are most likely to have negative effects. This also belongs to Laozi's 3 levels of knowledge, discrimination above, there is avoiding difficulties, and above avoiding difficulties, there is enlightenment. This chapter does not explicitly mention these 3 distinctions. So in this episode, what can we think about? We need to ask ourselves, if we really give up some knowledge or learning, can we reduce worries? Please think about it from this perspective.